Early one grey morning, somewhere in the late 1500s, a fisherman walking the sand at Ballantrae turned over a tangle of seaweed with his boot and found a human arm. Cured by the look of it. Packed in brine at some point, the flesh gone pale and firm from the salt, the fingers still curled at the end of it. He would have taken it for a dead seal or a spar off a wreck, right up until the fingernails. That is how the old story opens the case, and it does not stop at one arm. The tide at Ballantrae pulls back a long way, and over the months that followed it kept leaving things in the rack line, pieces of people arriving out of the sea already butchered and salted like ship's beef. Word travels along a coast faster than anywhere else. Coastal villages talk to each other through boats and markets and cousins, and within a season everybody between Girvan and Stranraer had heard about the limbs coming in on the tide. A thigh at one bay, part of a shoulder at another. Nobody could match them to a face, since the faces never came ashore. Drownings and wrecks only stretched so far as explanations. Drowned men wash up whole, or bloated, or half-eaten by fish in ways fishermen recognize. These pieces had been cut. Somebody with a blade had taken these people apart at the joints, the way a butcher takes apart a bullock, and then thrown the spare parts into the sea. The old account has an answer for where they came from, and it is one of the most appalling answers in the whole of British folklore. The pieces were scraps, leftovers. A household on that coast had more meat than it could eat, and what it could not eat, it threw away, and the meat was people. Travellers, packmen, farm servants walking home, women riding back from market. Over something like 25 years, the story says, upwards of 1,000 of them went into one cave in the cliffs at Bennane Head and never came out. And the family that lived in that cave, 48 of them by the time the count was done, one man, one woman, and 46 children and grandchildren bred entirely from each other, ate them. The man's name in the account was Alexander Bean. Everyone called him Sawney, an old Scots pet form of Alexander, and the story that carries his name has been frightening people for about 300 years now. I want to tell you the whole of it tonight, properly, the full tale as the old pages give it, the cave and the ambushes and the pickling barrels and the night it all came apart. And along the way I want to show you where the story comes from, a question with a stranger answer than you might expect. The earliest copies anyone can put a date on were printed a long way from Scotland, and a long time after any of this could have happened, and once you know that, the tale starts doing something interesting. You can weigh all of that for yourself as we go. The tale comes first, though, one of the darkest ever attached to a British coastline, and it deserves to be told slowly. Before we go down onto that beach quickly, welcome in. If you are new here, this is the channel where we sit with the grim corners of history for an hour or two and take our time with them, so get comfortable. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are listening from tonight. I enjoy going through those. It is always a strange mix of time zones down there. And a proper thank you to everyone supporting the channel on Patreon and through YouTube memberships. If you want to join them, the links are down in the description and in the pinned comment. Right. Back to the coast. The stretch of shore this story haunts sits in the far southwest of Scotland, in what used to be called Carrick, the southern part of Ayrshire, running down toward Galloway. If you drive it today, you take the A77 south out of Girvan toward Ballantrae, and for a few miles the road squeezes itself between the hills and the sea. Cliffs on your left, the Firth of Clyde on your right, the granite hump of Ayrshire Craig sitting out in the water like something dropped there. It is beautiful in the summer. In a January gale, it is one of the loneliest roads in the country, and in the 1500s it was lonelier still, because the road barely existed. A track, really, a line of trodden ground between settlements, crossing burns where the water let it, climbing over the headlands where the shore ran out. People walked it anyway, because they had to. A 16th century traveller on that coast was usually somebody with no choice in the matter. Packmen carrying cloth and needles and small goods between market towns, with everything they owned on their back. Drovers moving cattle, farm servants moving between hiring fairs, a wife riding pillion behind her husband on the one horse the household owned, coming home from Girvan or Ayr with the shopping done and a little drink taken. Messengers, beggars, the occasional laird with an escort. Most of them travelled in daylight if they could, and in company if they could, because everybody understood that a road with no houses on it belonged to whoever was on it with you. Carrick in that century was thin country for law. The king's writ ran there in theory. In practice, order depended on the great families, and the great family of Carrick, the Kennedys, spent a good part of the century at war with itself, the Cassilis branch against the Bargany branch, burnings and ambushes, and at least one celebrated case of a man being slowly roasted over a fire in a castle vault until he signed away an abbey's lands. Hold on to that image. A man roasted in Carrick by his own neighbours for the moral weather of the region this story chose to live in. A traveller who vanished on that shore had no shortage of possible endings. The sea took people, bogs took people, broken men, the era's phrase for outlaws with no lord and nothing left to lose, took people. If a packman set out from Ballantrae and never reached Girvan, his family might spend the rest of their lives not knowing which of those had happened, and the road offered no answers. It just lay there between the cliffs and the water, and it kept swallowing. That is the world the story asks you to accept, and honestly, that part needs no invention at all. Roads like that existed everywhere in early modern Britain, and people did vanish on them, constantly, in numbers we would find unbelievable now. No police, no registers of missing persons, no way to search beyond asking at farms and inns along the way. A disappearance was a hole in a family that never closed. The Bean story took that ordinary, universal dread, the dread of the empty road, and gave it a face and teeth and a front door that the sea locked twice a day. The face, according to the tale, was born a long way from Carrick, clear across the country on the east coast, and that is where the story properly starts, in East Lothian, within sight of Edinburgh, with a boy who would not work. The old accounts place his birth in the countryside of East Lothian, 8 or 9 miles east of Edinburgh, most retellings settling on the land around Musselburgh. His father was a hedger and ditcher, one of the men who did the unglamorous maintenance work of the agricultural world, cutting and laying hedges, digging and clearing the drainage ditches that kept fields from turning into marsh. Cold work, wet work, paid by the day, and utterly necessary. A hedger's hands were scarred to the wrist, and his back gave out early, and his son was expected to inherit the billhook and the spade and the aching spine along with the trade. Some versions make the family tanners instead, curing hides in pits of lime and dog dung, a trade so foul that towns pushed it outside their walls. Either way, the boy grew up at the bottom of a hard world, with a lifetime of other people's fields or other people's skins ahead of him. He refused it. That is the first thing the story tells us about his character, before the cave, before any of it. The Newgate calendar, the big London crime compendium that carries the most famous version of this tale, says he was very much prone to idleness and could not stand being confined to any honest employment. In the language of that literature, idleness is never just laziness, it is the seed of everything that follows, the first crack in a man through which the rest of him eventually falls. He tried the work, apparently, or was made to try it, hedging and ditching alongside his father through his youth. He hated it, and at some point, as a young man, he simply walked away from the whole arrangement, the trade, the parents, the parish, the entire web of obligation that held a labouring family together, and left. He did not leave alone. A young woman went with him, and she is one of the more unsettling figures in the story, partly for what the early versions say about her, and partly for what they do not. The oldest printed texts give her no name at all. She is simply a woman as viciously inclined as himself. That is the whole description, a single line that pairs them like two blades in one sheath. Later retellings, the ones that grew up around the legend in Scotland itself, fill her in. They call her Agnes Douglas, sometimes Black Agnes Douglas, and they say she came from Ballantrae or thereabouts, and that her own community had already turned on her before Bean ever arrived, whispering that she was a witch. Some tellings have her openly accused, blamed for cursed cattle and dead children, the standard portfolio of a 16th century witchcraft accusation, and driven to the edge of the community with the threat of the stake hanging over her. Whether she found him or he found her changes from version to version, and it hardly matters. What the story insists on is that they recognized each other. Two people who had each concluded, separately, that the world of parishes and churches and honest labour had nothing for them, and that they owed it nothing in return. Scotland in the late 1500s was a brutally conformist place. The Reformation had put a Kirk session in every parish, and the Kirk session watched everything: who came to church, who drank, who swore, who slept where. A man who would not work and a woman under suspicion of witchcraft were both, in their different ways, marked. Staying meant the branks or the stocks for him, sooner or later, and possibly the fire for her. The witch panics were not an abstraction in that generation. In 1590 and 1591, the North Berwick trials, a few miles along the coast from Bean's supposed birthplace, saw dozens of people tortured, and a woman named Agnes Sampson strangled and burned on the Castle Hill of Edinburgh, with the king himself taking a personal interest in the interrogations. If the later versions of the Bean story wanted a reason for a couple to disappear off the face of the earth, and Agnes with that word attached to her was a good one. So they went west, right across the width of southern Scotland, from the settled, watched farmland of Lothian into the emptiest coast the south of the country had to offer. The tale never explains the route and never needs to. What it wants you to feel is the direction of travel, away from every name they had, every debt, every neighbour, until the land itself ran out, and they were standing on the shore of the Firth of Clyde, with the Irish sea wind in their faces and nowhere further to go. And on that shore, at Bennane Head, they found the cave. You can still visit it, and people do, and the place's own strange afterlife is waiting for us at the end of this. For now, the geography. Bennane Head is a blunt headland of dark rock shoving out into the sea at the north end of Ballantrae Bay, about 3 miles up the coast from Ballantrae village and 11 or so south of Girvan. The rock there is peculiar stuff, ancient sea floor, pillow lavas from an ocean that closed 500 million years ago, folded up and shoved onto the land. And the sea has worked at it ever since, cutting inlets and hollows all along the base of the cliffs. On the north side of a little cove called Ballantrae Port, at the foot of the headland, the sea cut deeper than usual, and the result is a genuine cave, a winding passage running back into the cliff, forking into branches, with chambers opening off it, all of it in darkness a few steps past the entrance. The old story inflates it magnificently. The Newgate calendar version claims the cave ran almost a mile underground, and that at high tide the water pushed 200 yards into the passage, drowning the entrance completely twice a day. Modern visitors with measuring tape and better lighting will tell you the real cave is a fraction of that, deep enough to lose the daylight, deep enough to be thoroughly unpleasant alone, nowhere near a mile. But the detail the story is built on, the tide, is grounded in something real. The cave opens close to the shore, and the water does come up over the approach, and anyone who has scrambled along that beach at the wrong point of the tide and found themselves cut off understands exactly why the tellers reached for it. A door made of sea, open for a few hours, then shut, then open, on a schedule the moon keeps and no search party can argue with. Stand at the mouth of it, the story says, and you would swear nothing human could live inside. Perpetual horror and darkness, one version calls the interior, and the men who eventually came hunting along that shore with weapons in their hands looked straight at that black opening in the rock and walked on past it, because it did not occur to them that the thing they were hunting had a home, and that this was its door. Sawney and his woman moved in, and here the story pauses on an uncomfortable question, one it answers with a shrug, and the shrug is somehow worse than any explanation would have been. How does a couple live in a hole in a cliff? They arrived with empty hands and nothing on that bare shore to fill them honestly. The answer the tale gives is that Bean had already decided how he was going to live before he ever saw the cave. He was going to take what he needed from the road above, from whoever happened to be walking it, and the cave suited that trade perfectly, close enough to the track to hear hooves, hidden enough that no one would ever come looking, and guarded half of every day by the sea itself. The first travellers they stopped were robberies in intention. What made them something else was a decision the story presents as pure, cold reasoning, and it is the decision the entire legend turns on. A robbed man talks. A robbed man walks into Ballantrae or Girvan and describes your face, your height, your voice, the woman who was with you, and within a week, the countryside knows a pair of thieves is working the coast road, and then come the searches and the questions, and eventually the rope. Bean had no gang to protect him, no lord to shelter him, no second hideout. His entire security rested on one fact, and one fact only, that nobody knew he existed. So nobody who saw his face could be allowed to keep it in their memory. The Newgate calendar puts it in a single line that still lands like a slap. He never robbed anyone whom he did not also murder, every victim from the first. The account frames it as pure policy, settled before appetite ever entered the picture. Dead men give no descriptions, and for 25 years, the story says, that policy held so perfectly that the most hunted family in Scotland was never once described by a living witness, because it never left one. The eating came after, and the story is oddly matter-of-fact about how it started, and I think the matter-of-factness is deliberate. Two people alone in a cave on a bare coast, in winter, with a fresh corpse and no food. You can fill in the first time yourself. The tale does not linger on it, does not give us a scene of horror and trembling hands. It simply notes the outcome. They found that a dead traveller solved two problems at once. He could not talk, and he could be eaten. Robbery, murder and butchery collapsed into a single act, one economy, and from then on the road above the cave stopped being a hunting risk and became a larder that restocked itself day after day with every innocent soul who chose the coast path. Years passed like that, and the household grew. This is the part of the story that people flinch at even before the eating starts, and the old accounts deliver it with a bookkeeper's calm. Agnes bore children in the cave, 8 sons, 6 daughters, 14 children raised in the dark by 2 people who between them had cut every thread connecting them to the human race. Children who were never baptized, never schooled, never saw the inside of a church or a market or another family's house. Their world was the cave, the shore at low tide, and the work. And when those 14 came of age, in a household where no one else existed and no one else could be allowed to exist, they turned to each other. The sons fathered children on their sisters, the daughters bore children to their brothers, and in time the accounts imply to their own father. 18 grandsons, 14 granddaughters, 48 people in total, one bloodline folded back into itself for 2 generations, all of it inside that hole in the rock at Bennane Head. The practicalities never trouble the old accounts, and the gap where they should be is one of the strangest things in the story. 46 births in a sea cave, with no midwife but the family itself. Infants crying in a chamber where the only light was a driftwood fire, and the only lullaby was the tide coming up the passage. Children weaned onto the only meat the household ever had. A boy of 6 in that family had eaten human flesh his whole life and had no idea, none, that anything else was normal, because normal was a word from a world he had never seen. The grandchildren, the story notes, were begotten in incest and raised without the least notion of humanity or civil society. The younger ones had no world to reject. Nobody ever showed them one, and the family worked. That is the word for it. What Bean built in that cave over those years functioned like a trade being passed down, exactly the inheritance his own father had tried to hand him, except the family business was killing, and every child was apprenticed to it. The old accounts describe the method in enough detail that you can reconstruct a night's work. So here is what happened, over and over, for a quarter of a century, to somewhere between several hundred and 1,000 people, depending on the telling. It began with watching. The family kept eyes on the coast road, and they counted. This detail survives in every version, the counting, and it is the purest expression of how cold the whole operation was. They would take on foot travelers in groups of up to 4, 5, or 6. On horseback, never more than 2. Those were the limits, worked out, you have to assume, through experience, through some early evening when the margin got thin and somebody nearly got away. The clan could field a dozen or more grown killers by the later years, enough to overwhelm half a dozen walkers, but a mounted man has speed, so mounted men were only taken in pairs. Anything bigger than the limits was allowed to pass. A well-armed party of 8 would ride that road at dusk, feeling the loneliness of the place crawl on their necks, and never know that the rocks around them were full of eyes doing sums, and that the sums had come out in their favor. When the numbers were right, the family took the road. An ambush from the front, where the victims could see it, and with it the detail that ends every hope in the story before it starts. A second ambush behind, already in place. The Newgate calendar calls it an ambuscade, placed on every side. If a traveller broke through the first attack, if he was quick or strong or lucky, and turned and ran back along the only escape the path offered, he was running directly into the arms of the rest of the family, who had been standing in the rocks behind him the entire time, waiting for exactly this. The road was a corridor with a door at each end, and both doors were already shut. Then the killing. And the accounts are frank about it in a way that 18th century readers paid good money for. Throats were cut. That was the trade's standard stroke, fast and sure and quiet. A blade drawn hard across the neck and the victim folding into the heather while the life ran out of them in seconds. In some tellings, the women of the family took part in this with a relish the writers dwell on, crouching over the dying to drink the blood while it was still warm. Nobody was spared on any grounds. Men, women, the elderly, children travelling with their parents. The policy from the first murder still governed everything. A witness was a death sentence for the whole clan, so the road gave up everyone it held, every time, down to the last soul. What happened next is the part that separates this story from every other highwayman tale in the old crime books, and it has kept the story alive for 300 years. The family gathered the dead, stripped them of money and rings and clothing, and carried them home. Down off the road, over the rocks, along the shore to the black opening under Bennane Head, timed to the tide. And in the cave, the bodies were butchered. The accounts use the vocabulary of the meat trade without blinking. The corpses were quartered, broken down at the joints like any large carcass, and then the pieces were preserved, because a family of 48 on an unpredictable food supply cannot rely on fresh meat alone. Some was hung to dry in the cool air of the inner passages. The rest went into pickle, into barrels of brine, limbs packed in salt the same way every coastal household in Scotland packed its herring and its winter beef. Walk into the deep chambers of that cave in the story's telling, and you walked into a larder, human legs and arms hanging in rows from the rock, barrels standing against the walls with hands and feet floating in them, a store cupboard assembled from the population of Ayrshire. The craft in it is the detail I would most like to unknow. Taking a human body apart neatly is skilled work. Ask any anatomist, and the accounts show a household that had refined it into routine. A practiced hand goes in at the joints, hip and shoulder, knee and elbow, finding the seams with the knife point rather than hacking through bone. And a family processing a fresh body every week or so across decades would have grown faster and cleaner at it than most surgeons of the day. Children grew up on the chores of it, holding, fetching, scraping, salting, tasks scaled to the hands available. An apprenticeship served in firelight while the tide boomed in the passage. Then the sorting, meat to the drying lines and the barrels, clothing to one pile, coin and rings to another, and the remainder, the parts even that household had no use for, heads among them you would think, though the accounts go quiet on the specifics, went into the sea with the surplus, on the night tide, off the rocks below the entrance. Salt they would have needed constantly and in real quantity, and the story never says where it came from. Boiled out of seawater in pans over driftwood fires, at a guess, the one honest coastal industry the family ever practiced, carried on so they could preserve their neighbours. Dried and pickled human flesh was, the account says flatly, their only sustenance. All of it. Every meal, for decades. And the horrible economy of the thing worked almost too well, because the road kept providing whether the family was hungry or full, and preservation has limits, and 48 people can only eat so much. The surplus had to go somewhere. So at night, the family carried the spare pieces down to the water and threw them into the sea, and the sea, with no loyalty to anyone, carried some of them right back and laid them out on the beaches of Carrick and Galloway for the fishermen to find at dawn. That brings us back to where we started, the limbs in the tide rack, and now you know what the story says they were. Overstock. The pieces the family could not finish. Salted arms and brined legs bobbing out past the surf and coming ashore at Lendlefoot and Ballantrae and Girvan, to the astonishment and terror, one version says, of all the beholders. The countryside was being fed pieces of its own missing people and had no way on earth to understand what it was seeing, because on land, all anyone knew was the vanishing, year after year of it. A carrier sets out from Stranraer with a load of goods and is never seen again. The goods never turn up, the horse never turns up, nothing. A young couple walks to a fair and does not come home. A servant girl leaves one farm for another, a half-day's walk, and simply ceases to exist somewhere in the middle of it. One modern writer called the toll of this story the longest missing persons list in British history, and the list had no pattern anyone could hold, any age, any season. The one thing the disappearances shared was the stretch of country they happened in, and slowly, over years, that stretch of coast began to get a name. People rerouted. People waited for company. Carriers started refusing the shore road altogether, and the region began, in the old account's remarkable phrase, to be almost depopulated. A corner of Scotland going quiet because something in it was eating the traffic. Authority did respond. That detail matters, and the story includes it, and what it did with the response is arguably the cruelest thread in the whole tale. Reports went up the chain, to magistrates, to Glasgow, eventually to Edinburgh, that a district in the southwest was losing people at a rate no accident could explain. Spies were sent into the country, men whose job was to travel the roads quietly and watch. Some of them came back with nothing. A number of them, the account says, never came back at all. And you can work out for yourself what the family in the cave made of a stranger loitering alone on their road. The searchers became stock. The investigation was eaten along with everything else. With no bodies, no witnesses, and no suspects, the machinery of justice did what frightened machinery usually does. It found somebody. Travellers passing through the district were arrested on suspicion, on nothing better than being strangers in the wrong parish in the wrong month, and some of them, the account says plainly, were wrongfully hanged on bare circumstance. Innocent men choked out their lives on gallows in Ayrshire market towns, while the actual killers sat in their cave counting rings by firelight. It gets worse. Suspicion settled hardest on innkeepers, and the logic, once you hear it, is horribly sound. Take any man who vanished. Ask where he was last seen alive. The answer, over and over, was an inn, because inns were where travellers slept. So the innkeeper was the last known face beside every missing man on the list. Last seen at his house. Went the reasoning, so his house is where the road swallowed him. On that reasoning, landlords were taken, tried and executed, several of them. Hosts hanged for the crime of having given a doomed man his last supper. The survivors in that trade could count. All along the western roads, innkeepers looked at what was happening to their colleagues and got out, closed their doors, sold up, moved away, until, the old account says, lodging became hard to find in the whole district for want of anyone brave enough to keep a public house. Follow the ripples out and the picture is remarkable. One family in one cave, and around them, for miles in every direction, an entire region deforming itself. Roads abandoned, inns shuttered, neighbour informing on neighbour. Honest men hanged, and each wrong hanging teaching the countryside the same terrible lesson, that the thing taking people was still out there, unnamed, unfound, because the disappearances did not stop. The rope kept being used and the road kept eating, and nobody could make those two facts fit together. Behind every name on that list sat a household, and the story never visits a single one of them, so walk into one. A carrier fails to come home. For the first day, his wife tells herself the roads are heavy, or the business ran long, or he stopped over with his cousin at Colmanel. By the third day, she is asking at the change houses along his route, and by the end of the week her brothers are walking the shore path calling his name into the wind, checking the burns where a horse might have foundered, asking at every farm door whether anyone saw a man with 2 panniers and a grey garron pass. Nobody did. Or somebody did 3 days ago, heading south, fit and cheerful, and after that point on the road, nothing. As if the track itself had opened. She cannot bury him. She cannot remarry either, for years, since without a body the Kirk has no proof of widowhood, so she keeps his tools oiled and his side of the bed made and raises his children on the strength of maybe. 16th century Scotland had a whole grim vocabulary for this condition, the not knowing, and along one particular coast, in this story's world, whole villages spoke it fluently. Some families surely got the other ending, the worse one. A neighbour running up from the shore one morning because the tide had brought something in. And a woman walking down to the rack line to look at a forearm on the sand and being asked in front of everyone whether she recognized the hand. The story never stages that scene. It did not have to. Every listener along that coast for 300 years has staged it for themselves. The disappearances even bred their own explanations in the years before anyone knew. And the guesses people reached for say a great deal about the menu of fears a Scottish coast offered in that century. Kelpies took travellers, some said, water spirits in the burns and lochs that dragged riders under. The fairies took them, off the lonely stretches at dusk, a belief people held with complete seriousness and managed with iron and scripture and care about where you walked after sundown. Press gangs and pirates worked coasts like that in fact as well as fable, and a man vanished near the water could always have been taken for the sea. Wolves still had a toehold in the wilder parts of the country in that era, and broken men, the human wolves, needed no folklore at all. A district losing a soul every few days had all of those doors to knock on, and knocked on every one of them for 25 years, and the tellers clearly relished the irony that every guess was wrong, and that the truth was at once stranger than the Kelpies, and worse than the wolves. Whatever was taking the travellers of Carrick had a hearth, and children, and a pantry, and it was, in the one way that mattered most, local. 25 years, the story says, this went on. Take the number seriously for a moment. A quarter of a century is long enough for the first generation of the missing to become memories, for the fear to stop being an event and become a permanent feature of the landscape, something you raised your children on. Do not take the shore road. Along that coast, in the story's world, an entire generation grew up understanding that the empty miles south of Girvan simply took people, the way the sea takes people, without explanation and without recourse. Nobody guessed a family, nobody guessed the cave. The truth was so far outside what anyone could conceive that it protected itself. The account asks, in one of its better lines, how the clan could ever have been detected when not one person who saw them ever saw anybody else afterwards. Now, I promised you we would get to where this story comes from, and this is the place for it. While the family are still in their cave and the road is still disappearing travellers. The tale did not arrive out of nowhere. Scotland had cannibal stories long before anyone printed the name Sawney Bean, and a couple of them are so close to this one in shape that they are clearly part of the same family, and they are darker than you expect and considerably older. The oldest goes back to the 1340s, and it has a real famine wrapped around it. The chronicles record that around 1340 Scotland was hit by flooding, cattle plague, and a run of failed harvests, with the countryside stripped by war on top of it. And in the hills of Perthshire, the story goes, a butcher from Perth named Andrew Christie fell in with a band of starving scavengers in the foothills of the Grampians. When one of the band died of hunger, Christie, who knew carcass work the way other men knew ploughing, did to the dead man what he had spent his working life doing to sheep. The band ate, and having eaten once, they did not stop. They moved up into the mountain passes and began taking travellers, and Christie worked out a tool for it, an iron hook lashed to a long pole, a cleek in Scots, with a gaff he could swing up and drag a rider clean out of the saddle. Man and horse both went into the pot. Somewhere around 30 riders died in those passes, the story says, before an armed force came out from Perth and destroyed the band. And the ending is the unsettling part, because in the old telling Christie escaped the fight, walked out of the hills, changed his name, and lived out his days as a prosperous, respectable man somewhere else in Scotland, undiscovered. Scottish children were still being threatened with Christie Cleek centuries later. Behave, or Christie Cleek will get you, a nursery bogeyman who had, in the story at least, died in his own bed. You can already see the bones this shares with the bean tale. Ambush on lonely routes, butchery skills turned on people, a band destroyed by an armed expedition. The next story is closer still, and it comes with something like a pedigree because it appears in a printed history of Scotland from 1527, Hector Bose's history, written by a scholar from Dundee, a man notorious for preferring a good story to a dull document and repeated after him by other chroniclers. Bose records that in the reign of James II, so the mid-1400s, a brigand and his family, living hidden somewhere in the wilds of the south of Scotland, were found to have been killing travellers and eating them, the whole household living on the flesh of the people they robbed. When they were taken, the entire family was condemned and burned, all except the youngest, a baby girl a year old, who was judged innocent by age and given to foster parents in Dundee to be raised properly, in a town, in a family, in the church, with everything her birth household never had. She was about 12 when they caught her. The accounts say she had begun, in secret, to do what her family had done, and the detail Bose and his successors preserve is what she said when the town condemned her and the crowd followed her out to the execution ground, jeering. She turned on them. "Why do you scream at me?" she asked them, as if I had done something against the nature of man. And then, to the whole crowd, she said that if they knew how good human flesh tasted, none of them would ever eat anything else. They burned her, 12 years old, entirely unrepentant, and the crowd went home with that sentence in their ears. An English writer named Nathaniel Crouch retold the whole episode in a popular book in 1696, pinning it to the year 1459, a thief living privately in a den with his wife and children who had for years killed young people and eaten them. The family burned, the one spared daughter growing into the same appetite. The timing of that retelling has its own edge. Crouch published in the middle of the 1690s, the very years Scotland was being ground through the famine its people called the ill years, harvest after harvest failing, parishes burying 1/10 of their populations and more, starving families on the roads, and stories of what desperation drives people to eat suddenly very close to the bone on one side of the border. A London compiler serving up a Scottish cannibal family for entertainment, at the precise moment Scots were actually dying of hunger by the thousand, tells you something about the market, whatever it tells you about the past. 1696, remember, in London, only a generation or two before the first printed Sawney Bean, a den, a hidden family, travellers eaten, a mass burning, a daughter who carries the taint. If you have been paying attention, you have just heard most of the Bean story's skeleton, assembled a couple of centuries early, sitting in chronicles that predate any mention of Bennane Head. Famine cannibalism itself was no invention in medieval Scotland either. The country starved repeatedly in those centuries, and chronicle entries about people eating people in the worst years exist because the worst years truly got that bad. A generation before Christy Cleek's supposed hills, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1318 had crossed the whole of northern Europe, rain rotting the harvests summer after summer, and Scotland caught it with a war on top, the countryside picked bare by armies with nothing left to requisition. Chroniclers of that era wrote down things nobody wants attached to their nation's history: prisoners eaten in some places, corpses dug out of fresh graves in others, and whether every such entry records fact or panic, the entries exist, set down by sober men with ink and reputations to lose. Famine kept coming back on its own schedule for centuries afterward, and each visit refreshed the country's stock of whispered stories about what the starving had done, the raw material every cannibal legend in Scotland drew on. A population that had missed that many harvests in living memory found nothing unthinkable in a family eating travellers. The idea sat close enough to touch. Whatever else the Bean legend is, it grew in soil that had real horrors composted into it, old stories of hidden eaters in the hills that every Scots teller and every London printer had available on the shelf. Someone, at some point, took those bones, moved them to the Ayrshire coast, gave the man a name and a wife and 46 descendants, and produced the most infamous version of the tale ever told. When and who and why is a question with a surprisingly specific answer, and we will get to it. The family in the cave are about to make their first mistake in 25 years, and the story earns its climax, so the climax comes first. Actually, no. The paper trail is short, and it changes how the ending lands, so it goes here. And then we will walk back down onto that road for the last night of the Bean family's reign with everything in view. The strange fact at the centre of this legend fits in one breath. The events are set in Scotland somewhere in the 1500s, under a Scottish king. The earliest copy of the story that anyone has ever been able to put a firm date on was printed in London in 1734. Between between those 2 points, on the Scottish side, the silence is total. The 16th century in Scotland is not a dark age for records. Kirk sessions wrote things down, burgh councils wrote things down, and the Crown most of all, obsessively, especially about crime and treason and anything touching the king's person. Trials survive, executions survive, correspondence survives in stacks. Researchers have gone into that archive looking for the Beans for 200 years now, looking for a mass execution at Leith, a royal expedition into Carrick, a district emptied by disappearances, even a single line in a single letter about missing travellers on the Ayrshire coast. So far, the 1600s and 1500s have handed back nothing at all. The first Scottish printed versions folklorists can point to are cheap chapbooks, and the earliest dated survivors of those sit in the National Library of Scotland, with 1775 on them. The 1734 book is a thing called A General and True History of the Lives and Actions of the Most Famous Highwaymen, Murderers and Street Robbers, written under the name Captain Charles Johnson. And if that name rings a bell, it is the same pen name attached to the famous pirate history from the same era, the one that gave us most of what people think they know about Blackbeard. Nobody is certain who Captain Charles Johnson actually was. One long-running guess, unproven, points at Daniel Defoe, who wrote under dozens of names and had strong political opinions about Scotland. Whoever held the pen, the book was true crime entertainment for the London market. Dick Turpin and Moll Cutpurse and a rogues gallery of murderers. And sitting in among them, presented as history, is Sawney Bean, cave and clan and pickling barrels, essentially complete. The Newgate Calendar, the sprawling crime anthology that became a fixture of English households across the later 1700s, carried the tale onward, and that is the version most later retellings copy, sometimes word for word. Even inside those early texts, the dating wobbles. The calendar's own opening places, Bean's birth, while Elizabeth sat on the English throne and a James governed only in Scotland, so the era of James VI. Other printings shove the whole affair back into the 1400s under the earlier James I, or vaguely offer some 100 years since and move on. The victim count swings from about 100 in one edition to above 1,000 in another. For a supposedly historical event, the story could not keep its own dates straight from one printing to the next, and the printers clearly did not care. The smaller details drift just as freely, and collecting the variants is half the fun of chasing this thing through the old editions. The surname comes as Bean, Bean, Bane, occasionally Bane, and one local theory turns the whole question inside out by suggesting that Bennane, the headland itself, preserves an older form of the family name, the ground supposedly remembering what the books keep misspelling. The blood drinking appears in some printings and vanishes from others. Certain editions have the family habitually opening throats to drink at every ambush, a household of vampires in all but name, while soberer ones keep the eating and drop the drinking. The wife is nameless here, Agnes there, Black Agnes somewhere else. Even the famous execution wanders, most texts placing it at Leith, a few moving it to Glasgow, the woodcut illustrations on the chapbook covers recycling whatever cave or gallows block the printer had in the drawer. so that the same crude image of a hanged man served for Sawney 1 month and some Yorkshire murderer the next. None of this drift bothered anybody at the time. Chapbooks were the disposable media of their day, printed on paper 1 grade above wrapping, sold for a penny, passed hand to hand until they fell apart, and accuracy was never once the product. The shudder was the product. On that measure, the Bean pamphlets may be the most successful publications in Scottish history. One more detail from inside the text belongs in this pile, and it is my favourite, since the story planted it on itself. Go back to the treasure heaped in the cave, the inventory the account gives when the torches come in. Gold and silver, rings, swords, pistols, and watches. Watches. Personal watches, in the pockets of ordinary Scottish coast travellers, in the 1500s, when the article was a princely rarity across all of Europe, and a packman on the Ballantrae road owned, at his richest, a knife and a second shirt. By the 1730s, on the other hand, a pocket watch was exactly what a London highwayman lifted off a mail coach passenger, the standard loot of the standard robbery in every issue of the crime press, and a hack writer describing plunder would set one down without a flicker of thought. The word sits in the old account like a modern coin in a stage-set treasure chest, small, shiny, and completely out of period. And once you have noticed it, you cannot stop seeing the desk it was written at. The story, as ever, keeps its face straight. Then the name. Sawney, as I said, is an old Scots pet form of Alexander, perfectly innocent inside Scotland. In England, by the early 1700s, it had turned into something else. The dictionaries first record it in 1704 as a mocking generic label for a Scotsman, much as Paddy got used for an Irishman. On the London stage and in London print, Sawney was the stock Scot, dirty, backward, half-savage, and the caricature had legs for decades. One of the most notorious satirical prints of the century, first issued in 1745 while a Jacobite army was actually marching into England, shows a tartan-wearing Highlander called Sawney squatting in an English privy with his legs stuffed down the holes, too primitive, the joke goes, to know what the fixture is for. That is the climate the Bean story was first sold into. England and Scotland had been forced into a single state in 1707, and large parts of both countries hated the arrangement. Jacobite risings kept coming, and London's cheap presses spent those decades painting Scots as barely human. Into that market drops a book offering the ultimate barely human Scot, a cave-dwelling, incestuous eater of men, and his name, of all the names available, is Sawney. The insult itself wore out eventually. Through the 1800s, as the Union settled and Walter Scott made tartan fashionable in London drawing rooms, Sawney faded from the English vocabulary of abuse, and the word drifted back toward what it had been at the start, a countryman's form of Alexander, except that by then the story had claimed it. Say Sawney anywhere in Britain now, and nobody pictures a generic Scotsman. They picture one particular Alexander in one particular cave, and a jeer once aimed at an entire nation has ended up the private property of its most terrible legendary son, or its most terrible real one, depending on where you land with the evidence. Some modern scholars look at that and see the whole picture at once. Two folklore researchers at Scottish universities, Sandy Hobbs and David Cornwell, traced the tale's printed life back through the editions in the 1990s and concluded it starts, as far as anyone can show, in 18th century English commercial publishing, and that its long survival owes a great deal to it simply being a tremendous story to tell tourists. The historian Louise Yeoman has made the sharper argument. She points out that James VI was the most self-publicizing monarch of his age, a man who wrote a book about witchcraft, took personal charge of interrogations at North Berwick, and broadcast every plot against him and every triumph of his justice across 2 kingdoms. Hand that man a victory over a clan of 1,000 victim cannibals, she argues, and the pamphlets would have been printing before the fires at Leith were cold, and instead the rain that documented everything contains not a whisper. Her reading is that the story was built to sell books in England at Scotland's expense, and a researcher named Fiona Black has pushed the same point further, noting that calling a subjugated people cannibals is one of the oldest moves in the colonial handbook, used on the Irish, used across the Atlantic, used wherever one culture wanted to feel entitled to sit on another. On the other side of the argument sits the writer Sean Thomas, who went looking for Bean for 14 times and came away unconvinced by the propaganda reading, pointing out that the same crime books gave equal star billing to thoroughly English villains like Turpin, and suggesting instead that some real, smaller horror on that coast, its records lost or never made, might sit somewhere under 3 centuries of embellishment. The tellers themselves, he notes, kept insisting the tale was true. That is the state of the evidence. A story set in the 1500s, first found in print in London in the 1730s, wearing an anti-Scottish slur for a first name, built from bones that older Scottish chronicles had been rattling since the 1520s, and defended ever since by people who feel, walking that coast, that something must have happened there. Weigh it however you like. What nobody disputes is what the story became, and how completely one stretch of Ayrshire shoreline now belongs to it. Back then to the road, and to a market night somewhere around the turn of the 1500s into the 1600s, the night the whole structure came down. The family had held their discipline for 25 years. The counting, the double ambush, the total harvest of every witness, every rule had worked every time, and a system that has worked several hundred times in a row starts to feel less like a method and more like a law of nature. Then one evening the road sent them a man who broke it. He was a local man by the feel of the story, though no version troubles to name him, and he had spent the day at a fair with his wife. Fairs were the great punctuation marks of a rural year, livestock and stalls and drink and news. A day when the whole countryside funneled into one town and then, at dusk, funneled back out along every road at once. The pair of them were riding home along the coast track on a single horse, the husband in the saddle, his wife on the pillion seat behind him with her arms around his waist, warm, probably tired, probably a little merry. 1 horse, 2 riders. Inside the family's limits. From the rocks above the track, the count came out as it had come out hundreds of times before, and the clan came down on them. The first rush took the horse from the front. The man, and the story gives him this without ever giving him a name, turned out to be armed, and more than armed, capable. He had a sword and a pistol, and he used both, holding the saddle, wheeling the animal, riding attackers down under the hooves. The tale says he charged into the thick of them and trampled some into the dirt, fighting with a fury the family had simply never met on that road, because the road had never once been allowed to send a survivor to tell anyone that fighting was even possible. Everything about their method depended on shock and numbers and the ground, and for the first time in a quarter of a century, shock and numbers and the ground were not quite enough. They were enough for his wife. In the wheeling and the violence, she lost her seat or was dragged and came off the pillion onto the track into the middle of the family. And what the account says happened next is the single most infamous passage in the whole legend, so I will give it to you as the old pages do. The women of the clan were on her before she could rise. They cut her throat, there on the ground beside her husband's stamping horse, and then they crouched over her and drank the blood pumping out of the wound, sucking at the cut, the account says, with as much relish as if it had been wine. She may have still been dying while it happened. The text does not say she was dead. Then, with her husband still fighting a few feet away, close enough to see all of it, they opened her belly with their knives and pulled her entrails out onto the road, and began on her on the spot, without waiting to carry anything home. The husband saw the whole thing. His wife of that morning, dressed for a fair day, opened on the ground and handled by a crowd of ragged strangers who were eating. The story says the sight redoubled him, that grief and horror turned him into something the family could not pull down, and he fought on over her body with the pack closing from both sides, and he was losing. The double ambush had shut both doors. He was one man on a tiring horse, ringed by a family that had emptied this road of several hundred people, and by every rule the last 25 years had written. The next few minutes were already decided. The road broke its own rule instead. Down the track, out of the dusk, came noise, hooves and voices, 20 or 30 riders together in one body. More fairgoers heading home the same way, a crowd far past any limit the family's counting allowed. In all those years, the clan had never once been caught in the open mid-kill, and now they stood on a public road, blood to the elbows, over an opened woman, with a mob of armed and half-drunk countrymen bearing down on them. They ran. They gathered themselves and bolted for the thick wood between the road and the shore, dropped down through the rocks toward the tide line and the black doorway that had swallowed every secret they had ever made. And they left behind them, for the first time, the two things they had never left in a quarter of a century: a living witness and a scene. The fair crowd reined in around a picture out of a nightmare. A ruined woman opened on the track, her insides on the stones. A shaking man on a blown horse trying to put words to something he had watched from arm's length. Hoof marks, blood trails, and where the attackers had gone, nothing. Rocks and trees and the sound of the sea. The men from the fair got him away from her body and took him, the account says, to Glasgow, to the magistrates, and he stood in front of the provost of the city and told it all. The ambush from the front and the ambush from behind. The number of them, men and women together. The state of them. What the women had done with their mouths. And for the first time in 25 years, the authorities of Scotland were not looking at an absence, a name on a list and an empty road. They had a survivor, a location, and a description, and the description resembled nothing anyone had ever gone hunting for. The provost of Glasgow heard the story and sent it up the only chain there was, to Edinburgh, to the king. And this is where the tale reaches for the very top shelf, because in the version everyone tells, the king did not delegate. Within 3 or 4 days of the report arriving, the story says, James VI of Scotland rode out of Edinburgh in person at the head of about 400 men, with the survivor from the fair riding along as guide, bound for the Ayrshire coast. 400 is an army, in the terms of that era, a force you would raise against a rebellious lord, and the tale hands it to one family in one cave. If you know anything about James as a man, the casting is at least in character. This was a king fascinated to the point of obsession with hidden evil, a monarch who sat in on witch interrogations personally and published his own treatise on demonology, a man convinced that conspiracies against God and against his own person were woven through his kingdom, and that unmasking them was practically a royal sacrament. A clan of hidden man-eaters preying on his subjects for a generation is almost a story built for him. So the version everyone repeats puts him on the road west, and beside the 400 soldiers it adds the detail that ends up mattering more than all of them. Dogs. A large pack of bloodhounds brought along to do what 400 pairs of human eyes could not. The march west would have taken days, and the tale skips them. A royal army crossing southern Scotland was an event in itself. 400 men move with baggage, horses, food, farriers, servants, the whole rolling apparatus of an expedition, and word of what they were hunting travelled ahead of them faster than they did. In every town on the route, Lanark maybe, or down through Cumnock and Maybole, people came out to watch the column pass and to trade the story along. A monster in Carrick, a woman opened on the road, the king himself riding to it. For the survivor from the fair, guiding the force back toward the spot, every mile must have run the night backward. Somewhere on that road his wife was still lying wherever the neighbours had laid her, or what the family had left of her was, and the account never tells us whether he had even been able to bury that before the crown arrived and needed him. The story uses him as a signpost, points him at the coast, and forgets him. He is the only member of the whole cast who unquestionably deserved better from the tellers, and he does not even get a name to be sorry for. The force reached the coast and began working it. Beaches, woods, glens, the rocks along the tide line, miles of shoreline gone over by men on foot, with the survivor pointing out where the attack had happened, and the search producing exactly what every search of that coast had produced for 25 years. Nothing. The account is specific on one point, and you can feel the teller enjoying it. The searchers passed the cave. They stood at the foot of Bennane Head, some of them looking at the dark opening with the water moving at its lip, and moved on, because no one gave the smallest attention to it, the text says. Nothing human could be in there. Every man who had ever crossed that beach had made the same judgment at a glance. And for a quarter of a century, the judgment had been the family's outer wall. 400 armed men and the King of Scotland walked past the front door of the largest mass murder in the country's history, exactly like everybody else. The hounds did not walk past. Scent does not make judgments about what could or could not live in a hole, and the smell rolling out of that cave mouth must have been beyond anything in the dog's experience. Decades of blood and marrow and smoke and packed bodies breathing in the dark. Some of the bloodhounds surged into the entrance, and from inside the rock came the sound that finished the Bean family. A sudden storm of barking and baying and yelping echoing out of the cliff, hounds giving tongue on a find and refusing every call to come out. The soldiers stopped. Everyone looked at the black opening the dogs would not abandon. Understanding arrived, the account says, in the plainest possible form. The dogs would not be making that noise over nothing. Torches went up, and the king's men went in. Single file at first, most likely, splashing through the wet mouth of the passage, following the sound of the pack into a corridor the story describes as an intricate, winding maze of turns, absolute blackness beyond the torchlight, the roar of the dogs bouncing off the stone ahead of them. Step after step into the hill, weapons out, light held high, every man waiting for whatever the hounds had found to come boiling up the passage at them. And then the passage opened out, and the torchlight reached the walls of the inner chamber, and 400 men found out where 25 years of Ayrshire's missing had gone. The smell would have arrived before the light did. Old smoke, tallow, packed unwashed bodies, brine, and under all of it the sweetish, clinging note of cured flesh, filling a confined space that had breathed it for decades, thick enough that hardened soldiers must have gone to their sleeves. Their torches threw the hanging rows into motion, shadows swinging on the walls with every step, and the account lingers on the moment of recognition, the second or two in which a man's eye tells him he is looking at a well-stocked larder, sides of meat, salting barrels, an orderly household store, before it picks out a hand at the end of one of the sides, and the whole picture turns over at once. The dead hung in rows, legs, arms, thighs, hands and feet, of men, of women, of children, dressed and hung up along the rock as any smokehouse in Scotland hung its winter beef. Cured meat with fingernails and toenails. Barrels stood in ranks with brine glinting at the rim, and in the brine, more of it, limbs packed in pickle, a salted archive of the district's disappearances going back further than anyone present had been alive. And heaped around the chamber, in mounds glinting under the torches, everything the meat had owned. Gold and silver coin, watches, rings, swords, pistols, and clothing, linen and wool, bundle after bundle of it, stripped from the dead across a quarter of a century and thrown into piles, because the family that killed for it had nowhere on earth to spend a penny of it. Money enough to buy half of Carrick, mouldering in the dark under a cliff, guarded by hanging bodies. Somewhere in that chamber, past the barrels and under the swinging rows of what they had made, were the beans. All of them, the story says. Sawney himself, old now if the dates mean anything, Agnes, the 8 sons and 6 daughters, the 18 grandsons and 14 granddaughters, The entire crossbred household of 48, cornered in the one place on the planet they knew, with the tide behind them and 400 swords in front, and the dog's noise filling the rock like the end of the world. The account does not describe a battle, and refuses the family even that. They were taken, seized, bound, pinioned at the king's order, hauled one by one along their own corridor, past their own larder, out through the low, bright doorway into the last daylight most of them would ever stand in. What could be gathered of the victims was carried out too. The men brought the hanging limbs and the pickled remains out of the chambers and buried them there on the shore, in the sands, an anonymous mass grave for an unknowable number of people, its location now as lost as their names. The heaped valuables were inventoried and carted off. Where any of it went, the story never says, and the omission is oddly loud. A quarter-century of stolen gold, enough to enrich every parish the family had emptied, vanishes from the account the moment it leaves the cave, presumably into the crown's baggage, and none of the tellings ever spares a line for restitution, for the widows of the missing, for anyone. The treasure exists in the tale to measure the crime, and once the measurement is taken, the money evaporates as completely as the people it was stripped from. And the family began the long march east, the entire clan of them roped and driven along the roads of southern Scotland toward Edinburgh, and the story pauses on what that march looked like, because word ran ahead of the column the whole way. All the country, as the account puts it, flocked to see the cursed tribe pass. From every farm and every parish along the route, people walked to the roadside to look at them. Some of those people, you have to assume the tellers intend this, had gaps in their own families. A father who never came home from Ayr, a daughter lost on the shore road 20 years back. And now they stood at the verge and looked into the faces of a shuffling, snarling column of the people who had eaten them. 46 human beings who mostly had never seen a town, a road with traffic on it, a crowd, or that many strangers in their lives, marched through a gauntlet of everything they had preyed on, all the way to the capital. In Edinburgh they were put in the toll booth, the grim old prison tower that stood beside St. Giles on the High Street, the building where the city kept its condemned and displayed the heads of its traitors on iron spikes. One night, the account says, that is all the process the Beans got, and the next morning they were taken out of the city, down the road to Leith. And what was done to them there is the last act of the story, and the tellers, having spent the whole tale on the family's cruelty, spend the ending proving the 17th century could match it. Leith gave them no trial. The account states it outright and does not blush. The whole clan was executed without any process, and the reason given has a cold legal elegance to it. It was judged needless to try creatures who were professed enemies to all mankind. Scotland in that era took procedure seriously, even for witches, even for traitors. Everyone got some form of assize, some parchment, some formal machinery between accusation and death. For the Beans, the machinery was set aside. The Crown's position, as the story frames it, was that a trial exists to establish whether a human being committed a crime, and nothing in that column of prisoners qualified for the noun. They had eaten their way out of the species. You do not try the wolf. Leith was Edinburgh's port, a working town of quays and shipyards a couple of miles from the city, and executions there drew enormous crowds off the boats and out of the winds. What the crowd got that day, the account lays out in one long, unflinching sentence, and I will take it slowly. The men died first. Sawney and his sons and grandsons, 27 of them by the count, were taken and held down, and the executioners went to work with blades. Their genitals were cut off first, severed and thrown into a fire in front of them while they were held there living. Their hands were struck off, their legs were severed from their bodies. And then, limbless and gelded, cauterized by nothing and bandaged by no one, they were left on the ground to bleed. The account is precise about the timing, and the timing is the punishment. They bled to death in some hours. Hours. 27 men in a row on bloody ground, stumps pumping, the piles of severed hands and feet growing beside the fire where their manhood had gone, dying at whatever speed their opened arteries dictated, some quickly, some not, while the crowd of Leith watched them empty. The women and the children of the family were kept standing there through the whole of it, the account names that as deliberate. The wife, the daughters, and the grandchildren, having been made spectators, it says, of this just punishment inflicted on the men. Made spectators. 21 women and girls. From Agnes down to grandchildren young enough that some of them may not have understood anything except the noise and the blood, forced to watch their fathers and brothers and sons taken apart alive by installments. And when the last of the men had finished dying, the executioners turned to the watchers, and the second half of the sentence was carried out. 3 great fires had been built. The women and children were bound, distributed among the 3, and burned alive. All of them. Agnes, the 6 daughters, the 14 granddaughters, the youngest of the family along with the oldest, the account granting no exception for age in either direction, 21 human beings screaming in 3 columns of smoke over Leith while the tide came in on the shore behind them. The tellers keep one last detail for the very end, and it is the one the whole tradition seems proudest of. Nobody repented. Through the maimings, through the bleeding, through the burning, the account says the family died to the last gasp cursing, flinging imprecations at the crowd, at the executioners, at the whole species they had spent their lives eating, a defiance with nothing underneath it, least of all fear. Later retellings sharpen the moment into a legend of its own, putting a final line into Sawney's mouth as he lay bleeding out among his sons, a sentence you will find on tourist plaques and in paperback horror anthologies, though you will search the old texts for it in vain. It is not over. It will never be over. Whether anyone ever said it, the coast took the sentiment to heart, as you will hear. A quieter variant of the ending belongs here before we move on. A few branches of the tradition refuse the whole spectacle at Leith. In those tellings, the king's men never bothered with rope and roads and the toll booth at all. Having found the cave and understood what it held, they packed the entrance with gunpowder or simply sealed it with stone and blew the cliff shut, entombing the entire family alive in their own larder, in the dark, with the barrels and the hanging dead and the money, to finish however starvation and each other decided. That version tidies everything away at a stroke: the march, the spectacle, the fires, and, a cynic might observe, any need for evidence, an ending shaped exactly like the silence in the records. The main tradition, though, wants the fires at Leith, and it wants the bleeding to take hours, and after 300 years of retelling, that is the ending the story keeps. What the ending meant back on the coast, no version bothers to record, and the omission invites you to fill it. Along 30 miles of shore, households that had spent years or decades holding a door open for someone finally had their answer, delivered in the worst currency available. The father who never came home from Ayr had been eaten, and eaten by neighbours of a sort, people living 11 miles down the coast the whole time. Grief with an answer in it moves differently, and this answer came with details: the barrels, the drying lines, the surplus on the tide, every particular running up the coast with the news of the capture, until each family could privately furnish the fate of its own missing. Some of them, you would think, walked down to the sands below Bennane Head, where the king's men had buried what they carried out of the cave, and stood over the shared grave of everyone's losses, unable to point at any part of it and say, "That portion is ours." The roads came back to life within a season, presumably. Carriers took the shore route again. Inns relit their fires. The district refilled. Ordinary traffic flowing back into miles that had been starved of it for a generation. And every traveller on that road for the next 100 years would have crossed Bennane Head a little faster than the miles either side of it. Eyes going once to the rocks below, the habit outliving the family and the century both, and, on the strength of the tourist trade, everything since. The tale proper stops there, with the smoke over the port. Except in one town on the Ayrshire coast, it never quite stopped, and the coda that town tells is in some ways the saddest piece of the whole legend. Girvan, remember, sits 11 miles up the shore from the cave, the nearest real town to the family's hunting ground, the community that lost more to the beans, in the story's world, than anywhere else on earth. Girvan tradition holds that one member of the clan was missing from the count at Leith, and it knows exactly who and what happened to her and where. One of Bean's daughters, this telling says, left the cave. When and how old she was, the tradition does not say, but at some point in the family's long reign, a young woman walked out of that life, alone, and did the one thing no Bean had done in a generation. She joined the world. She came up the coast to Girvan and settled there, quietly, among the very population her family was eating, and she lived as an ordinary woman of the town, and nobody knew. She had a house, she had neighbours, and on a piece of ground in what is now Dalrymple Street, she planted a tree, An act with a defiant sort of hope in it, a thing you do when you intend to stay somewhere and watch something grow. The town came to call it the Hairy Tree, and nobody now can tell you why with any confidence, though the name stuck harder than the reasons ever did. Then Leith happened. The clan was taken. The story of the cave ran up and down the coast with the speed horror always travels at, and somewhere in the boiling aftermath, Girvan learned who its quiet neighbour was, what she had come from, whose daughter she had been all along, through every market day and every shared wall. Nothing in the tradition says she had ever harmed a soul in the town, and nothing says the town paused on that question for a moment. A crowd took her. Nobody sent for a magistrate. The king's justice had, after all, just skipped its own trial, and they dragged her to Dalrymple Street, to the tree she had planted with her own hands, and hanged her from its branches. Her sapling had grown enough to bear the job. The one being who left the cave, the one who chose the world her family fed on, ended swinging from the only living thing she had put into it, killed by her neighbours for her surname. Girvan children were still daring each other about the Hairy Tree centuries later, and the belief attached to it survives in the town to this day. Stand under the tree, it goes, and listen, and you can hear the creak of the bough taking her. In recent years, local campaigners have argued about which tree on Dalrymple Street is the tree, or whether the one people point at now is a later stand-in, and older residents have muttered that they never heard the story growing up at all, and the argument itself, a town quarrelling in the 21st century over which exact tree hanged a cannibal's daughter 400 years ago, might be the most Sawney Bean thing to ever actually happen. Nobody can find her name. The tradition hangs her and forgets to record it. What Girvan does with the story now is its own small study in how a town lives with a legend it cannot verify and cannot quite drop. Dalrymple Street is an ordinary shopping street, chip shops and charity shops and parked cars, and somewhere along it, depending on who you ask, stands or stood the tree. And the asking is the point, since answers genuinely differ from door to door. Older residents have gone on record saying the whole Hairy Tree business was news to them, nothing their grandparents ever mentioned, while others grew up daring each other under a specific tree on dark nights and listening for the rope. A few years back, local campaigners pushed to have the tradition properly marked, a plaque, a replanting, an acknowledged spot, and the effort stirred up a very Scottish argument about whether you commemorate a thing you cannot document, and whether the commemorating creates the tradition it claims to preserve. Meanwhile, the town's position on the wider legend is happily unresolved. Girvan sits 11 miles from the most infamous cave in Scotland, close enough to claim it for the visitors and far enough to disown it at need, and it manages both, sometimes in the same conversation. Ask in the right pub and you will get the cave, the daughter, and the creaking bough delivered with total conviction, and then, on your way out, a quiet word at the door, that it is all just stories, mind. Both halves are offered sincerely. Legends this old do not ask a town to choose. Before the story moves into its strange afterlife, one more look at the ending itself, the mutilations and the fires. Modern listeners sometimes assume that part must be the wildest invention in the whole tale. The record of the period points the other way. Whoever first wrote the Bean execution down, whenever they wrote it, was working from life. Every element of that scene at Leith was standard equipment in the justice of early modern Britain, and the audience the story was printed for would have recognized all of it. Take the dismemberment of the men. English law of the period dealt with high treason by hanging a man briefly, cutting him down alive, castrating him, opening his belly, burning his bowels in front of his face, and then quartering the body. And it did this in public, on scaffolds, for centuries, to famous men whose names you know. The Bean version, the severed hands and legs and the slow bleeding, is that ritual rearranged, cruelty by amputation instead of cruelty by knife and fire, and if anything it is the more drawn out of the two. Take the burning of the women. Scots law burned women regularly for witchcraft, for treason, for incest, usually with the small mercy of strangling first, though the mercy could be withheld, and in the Bean story it is withheld. Agnes Sampson, the real Agnes taken in the North Berwick panic, went to the Castle Hill fire in 1591 at the personal insistence of the same James VI this story puts at the head of the manhunt. A crowd at Leith watching 21 females burn in 3 fires would have been watching a scaled-up version of a civic event their grandchildren would still be attending. The last witch burnings in Scotland came well over a century after the Bean's supposed era. Even the missing trial has a real shape behind it. Early modern law held a category for people it considered outside the protection of the community altogether: outlaws, broken men, those put to the horn as the Scots phrase went. And a person in that category could in certain circumstances be killed where taken. Declaring the Beans enemies of mankind and executing the lot without process pushes the idea to its limit. 48 people, including small children, put to death on the Crown's word alone, but the idea itself sat live in the law books of the day. The story's first audiences did not need convincing that a state could do such things. Their state visibly could, and periodically did, at the end of their own streets. Part of the tale's grip, I think, has always been exactly this, that the rescue and the punishment arrive from the same moral universe as the crime. The family drains a woman on the road and drinks her. The Crown answers by unmanning 27 men into a fire and burning children alive, and the story hands you both with the same steady face and moves on to the next paragraph. 18th century readers apparently swallowed that whole. It tends to sit harder now. The toll booth, for what its walls are worth, was real down to the spikes. The old prison tower on Edinburgh's High Street served as the city's main jail from the 1560s, and it was every bit as grim as the story needs. Cramped and freezing, a building where torture happened and where the heads and limbs of the executed were mounted on the outside ironwork as municipal decoration. If the Beans had ever actually spent their last night anywhere, the toll booth is where that night would have been spent. A family from a cave full of hanging limbs, sleeping under a roof decorated with them. The building came down in 1817, and Edinburgh marked its footprint with brass sets in the pavement, a heart shape by the west door of St. Giles. And to this day locals spit on it for luck as they pass, an old contempt for the prison still being paid out 2 centuries after the prison stopped existing. Stand on that heart on a wet afternoon and you are standing, give or take a few feet, where the story says 48 cannibals spent their final night on Earth, while tourists step around you photographing the cathedral. The road out to Leith is a bus route now. The port has cocktail bars. Nothing marks any spot where the fires might have stood, no plaque. And given that the archives offer nothing to pin one to, that is probably the honest arrangement. One more thing about the choice of ground, though, fits the period beautifully. The sands at Leith were among Scotland's traditional execution places for crimes connected with the sea, and the old law liked its symbolism served cold. Pirates condemned in Edinburgh were taken down to Leith and hanged within the flood mark, on gibbets planted below the high tide line, so that the element they had offended against could come in over the business twice a day, and the sea was left to deal with what remained. A story that needed to finish a family whose front door was the tide could hardly have picked better ground. Whether its first tellers knew the sands custom or simply knew Leith as the place Edinburgh did its grim public work, the choice lands the same either way. The clan the sea had hidden for 25 years, dying on the one beach in Scotland where the sea was part of the apparatus. The story's geography ends there anyway. Its life, though, was only starting, and the two places it settled into for the long haul could not be less alike. One is the printed page, and we have covered how it got there. The other is the cave itself, and the cave's own history since. The genuine, documented 20th century history of that hole in Bennane Head is stranger than almost anything in the legend, and considerably sadder. The drive down from Girvan sets the mood on its own. The modern road hugs the shore through Lendlefoot, past the very beaches the legend paves with salted limbs, and the villages along it are quiet holiday places now. Caravans, a picnic lay-by, sea anglers parked at the verge with their rods out over the exact tide line the fishermen of the story worked. Families eat sandwiches on that sand every summer without a flicker, and most of them have no idea, since nothing along the water advertises any of it, and officialdom has never put up so much as a brown tourist sign pointing to the most infamous cave in Scotland 3 minutes further on. That silence is a choice, and probably a sensible one, and it lasts right up until you find the place yourself. From that point, the approach does half the storytelling for you. The old coast road over Bennane Head has been bypassed. The modern A77 swinging traffic inland and down to the ferry ports, so the original stretch sits closed and crumbling, weeds in the tarmac, a road with no reason left to exist. Above a beach most people never learn is there. You park where you can, find the path, and pick your way down the cliffside and along the rocks, and the last stretch is only really comfortable at low tide, an arrangement the story would appreciate. The cave mouth opens in the north wall of the little cove at Ballantrae port, and at some point in the 1800s, somebody, and nobody now knows who or what for, built a wall across the front of it, with a doorway and a window, so the thing greets you half-sealed, a stone face with one eye and an open mouth, and you step through the doorway into the dark with the sea working the rocks behind you. Inside, the passage runs back and forks, walkable, dry, utterly black beyond the first bend. Cavers who have surveyed it will tell you it forks at a junction perhaps 20 meters in, with the longer branch splitting once more near its end at a small chamber, and the walls are ancient pillow lava under a modern crust of spray paint, because people have been coming here to feel this exact feeling for a very long time. The graffiti is its own archaeology, names and dates layered over names and dates. And the tide still shuts the beach on schedule. Visitors write up their trips online, and my favorite genre of those reviews is the overnighters, people who carried camping gear into sleep where the beans slept, and woke to find the water across the approach and themselves locked in until the sea decided otherwise, sitting at the mouth of Sawney Bean's cave waiting to be released, posting about it afterwards with a cheerfulness you can tell is only mostly real. Between the legend and the present, the cave had working centuries, and local tradition gives it employment that suits it. Through the 1700s, this coast ran a roaring free trade, luggers coming over from the Isle of Man and Ireland with brandy, tea, salt and tobacco, landing cargoes by night at exactly the quiet coves the beans supposedly hunted from. And the trade needed dry, hidden storage above the tide. Caves answered, and Ayrshire folk memory duly stocks this one with kegs. If any of that is true, and the smuggling itself is documented fact on that shore, even where the particular cave is only tradition, then the legend may have been the best security a free trader ever had. A store watched over by a man-eating ghost story needs no guard. No exciseman's local hire was going to grope his way into Sawney Bean's front hall on a moonless night to count barrels. And a smuggler with any wit would have fed the story rather than starved it. Folklorists have noticed the pattern all over Britain, hauntings that happen to cluster on landing beaches and cave mouths, terror doing duty as a padlock. The stone wall across this entrance, the one nobody can date or explain, would make perfect sense as a warehouse front, and if the bean tail ever earned honest money before the tourists came, that was probably the trade it earned it in. The cave also, within living memory, had a resident, and his story deserves better than the footnote it usually gets. Through the 1900s, the cave was known locally as a doss for travelling men, tramps working the coast roads, and in the 1920s one of them, a man remembered only as Snib, used it often enough that the place picked up his name. Then, somewhere around the middle of the century, a new man arrived and stayed and stayed and stayed. His name was Henry Ewing Torbet, born in Dundee in 1912, and the accounts of his earlier life say he had been a bank worker there, a man with a desk and a ledger book existence, until something, and nobody ever learned what, made him walk away from all of it. He took the old tramp's name, called himself Snib, precisely so that his own past could not follow him, and he moved into the cave at Bennane Head, and he lived in it for roughly 30 years. The people of Ballantrae got to know him the way you get to know a mountain, at a respectful distance, on his terms. Snib Scott, they called him. He would do odd jobs around the district and do them well. He would accept food or cigarettes or the use of somebody's tap and soap, and he would accept absolutely no money, ever, from anyone, a rule he held to with a stubbornness the whole coast came to respect. Locals worked out the etiquette over the years. You did not hand Snib charity to his face. You left it, bread or tins or tobacco, on a stone dike near the cave path, and walked away, and once you were properly gone he would come and take it, and dignity was preserved on both ends of the transaction. A man with a witch-haunted address and a serial killer's front door, and the district's collective memory of him is gentleness, independence, and a firm handshake on a completed job. December of 1983 finished it. He was 71 years old, living in an unheated sea cave on the Ayrshire coast in a Scottish winter, and he was found in the cave collapsed, with pneumonia and hypothermia both at work on him. They got him out and into hospital, a building with walls and heating and beds, everything he had spent 3 decades declining, and 2 days later, he died in it. The coast did not shrug and move on. Money was raised by public subscription, and a Ballantrae man named Sparkhall gathered stones off the shore below the cave, the same shore the legend paves with butchered limbs, and built a memorial cairn near the cave mouth with his own hands. It stands there now with a plaque for Henry Ewing Torbet, respected and independent. And if you make the scramble down to see the monster's house, the first monument you actually reach commemorates the kindest thing that ever lived in it. The legend, of course, has kept moving into the cave regardless. In 2023, walkers coming along the shore found that someone had been in with tools. An anonymous sculptor, believed to be working out of central Scotland, had carved a head, a face, and set it inside the cave, gazing out of the dark toward the entrance, Sawney himself installed in his own doorway by an artist who never left a name. Photographs of it went around the world within days. Nobody commissioned it, nobody claimed it. The coast simply woke up one morning, and the cave had a face again, and of every monument ever raised to this story, an unsigned head staring out of the actual dark of the actual cave is the one the material deserves. Which leaves the question of how a tale from cheap London crime print ended up owning that coast in the first place, and the answer plays out across the 19th century, decade by decade, in ways you can actually watch. The Newgate calendar kept the story in circulation through the late 1700s, one gruesome biography among hundreds, sitting on English shelves between poisoners and forgers. By the early 1800s, the family had climbed off the page entirely. London theatres staged Sawney Bean melodramas, more than one of them, painted cave flats and stage blood, and an actor in rags snarling at the pit, the man-eater of Scotland, as a night's entertainment for the same city that had first printed him. Chapbook versions, the little folded penny booklets peddlers carried in packs, spread the tale through fairs and cottages on both sides of the border, and Scots themselves began buying their monster back. The formal adoption papers, if a legend can have them, got signed in 1843 in Kirkcudbright, down the Solway coast from Bean's hunting ground. A local writer and publisher named John Nicholson put out a collection called Historical and Traditional Tales Connected with the South of Scotland, and in among the ghosts and the Covenanters, he included Sawney, retold in his own words, and with that a Scottish author in a Scottish town presented the story to Scottish audiences as a piece of their own tradition. Nicholson tinkered, as every teller tinkers. His version shoves the dates far back, giving Bean a birth in the late 1300s, which quietly detaches the story from James VI, and all those inconveniently well-kept records and folk memory around Galloway followed his framing for generations. From Nicholson onward, the tale stops being an English import and starts being what it is now, a thing Ayrshire and Galloway people tell about their own coast, with their own place names holding it down. The Victorians, predictably, adored it. The century that invented the penny dreadful and queued around the block for murder trials was never going to leave a cannibal clan nearly 50 strong alone, and by the late 1800s, the story was appearing in sensational miscellanies, alongside whatever fresh horror the newspapers were carrying, retold for readers who had just lived through the Whitechapel autumn and had discovered a bottomless appetite for the worst things human beings do. Then, in 1896, the legend got its literary promotion. Samuel Rutherford Crockett, a Galloway minister turned best-selling novelist, one of the most popular Scottish writers of his generation, built a whole historical romance on that coast, The Grey Man, set in the reign of James VI, and woven around the real blood feud between the two branches of the Kennedy family, the actual documented Carrick feud I mentioned near the start, the one featuring a man roasted in a castle vault. And straight into that documented world of real lairds and real burnings, Crockett planted the beans. His set piece is still, for my money, the best scene anyone has ever written inside that cave. The novel's young hero and his companions, caught on the shore, take refuge in the cavern under Bennane Head, climb to a ledge in the dark, and then have to lie there in silence as the family comes home below them, the whole ragged clan pouring in from a night's work with sacks, and the sacks are unloaded, and the boys on the ledge inches above them watch the contents hung up and understand where they are hiding. Crockett wrote it slow, the torch shadows, the voices, the sounds of the household settling in around its stores, discovery hanging over every page, and Victorian Scotland devoured it. The book sold hugely, went through printing after printing, and cemented the geography for good. After The Grey Man, the cave at Bennane Head stopped being one candidate location among several vague possibilities and became the address. Ordnance survey maps had marked a cave there for decades. Tourists now arrived asking for it by the family's name. By the end of the century, they were arriving in numbers. The railway had reached Girvan decades earlier. The coast road was carrying excursion traffic, and the cave settled into the itinerary of the Ayrshire holiday, somewhere between the golf links and the boat trips out to Ayrshire Craig. Guidebooks to the district gave it a paragraph and a shiver. Charabanc drivers on the shore run worked up their patter, slowing at Bennane Head to point out the spot and deliver the pickling barrels to a coachload of trippers in their Sunday hats, and generations of visitors scrambled down at low tide to stand in the entrance, strike a match, lose their nerve at the first bend, and climb back up feeling they had touched something. Initials and dates began accumulating on the rock. Picnics were eaten on the very sand the story fills with buried limbs. A legend that had started life, on the paper trail at least, as London entertainment was becoming Ayrshire infrastructure, an actual stop, with an actual path worn down to it, and the local economy has never seen a reason to hand it back. The 20th century kept him in print from its early years. In 1928, Dorothy L. Sayers, the crime novelist, assembled a landmark anthology of detection and horror stories for a British publisher, one of the defining collections of its era, reprinted over and over, and in among the fiction she set the old Newgate calendar account of Sawney Bean, presented straight, and readers who had bought the book for detective puzzles turned a page and found the pickling barrels waiting for them. Anthologists have been making the same move ever since. The tale moves like fiction, carries itself like history, and sits comfortably in either section of the bookshop, and editors long ago realized that the uncertainty is a feature. You get to the end and the question of whether any of it happened starts working on you, and the story rides that question straight into your memory. Set Sawney beside Scotland's documented monsters, and his odd position in the national memory comes into focus. Edinburgh, the city that supposedly burned his family at its port, later produced a pair of killers nobody disputes. In 1828, William Burke and William Hare smothered 16 people in the closes of the West Port and sold the bodies, fresh and unmarked, to the anatomy school of Dr. Robert Knox, who paid in guineas and asked no questions worth recording. Hare talked his way out of the noose by giving evidence against his partner. Burke was hanged in January of 1829 before a crowd counted in the tens of thousands, and then, in a stroke of judicial poetry, handed over to the anatomists himself, publicly dissected in the same manner as his merchandise, and Edinburgh keeps the receipts to this day. His skeleton stands in a glass case at the university's anatomical museum. A pocketbook bound in his own tanned skin sits in the museum at Surgeons' Hall, and you can walk in and look at it this afternoon. A real, archived Scottish murderer comes with all of that: paperwork, trial transcripts, a named judge, a skeleton with a visiting address. Sawney, after 400 years of people looking, comes with a cave and a story, and yet ask a stranger anywhere on earth to name a Scottish killer, and the family from Bennane Head has every chance of surfacing before the West Port ever does. Burke and Hare hold the evidence. Sawney holds the shudder, and the shudder travels lighter and lives longer. Print never let go of him either. In 1975, a researcher named Ronald Holmes published The Legend of Sawney Bean in London, the first full book-length attempt to walk the story back through its sources, and most of what later writers know about the chapbook trail runs through his spadework. Other full-length studies have followed since, and the academic folklore journals have their entries too, the Hobbs and Cornwell paper among them. A story with no verifiable bodies has by now generated a respectable bibliography, shelves of careful people pursuing a family that may only ever have existed as ink. All of that shelf work came late, though. For most of its life, the story moved by voice. Chapbook copies were scarce along the coast, and print belonged to those with schooling, so the tale travelled as winter night material, told at farm kitchen hearths in Carrick and Galloway, when the day's work was done, and the wind was busy in the thatch, and the tellers shaped it for the room. The voice drops for the cave. A pause opens before the larder. The youngest listeners are allowed to lean all the way in before the dogs start baying in the rock. Grown men who had walked the shore road at dusk that same week sat with the rest of the household and felt it work on them anyway. And the mothers of that coast put the story to a purpose, the office every durable monster ends up holding. Stay off the shore after dark, or Sawney will have you. Keep out of the caves. The same duty Christy Cleek was performing in nurseries further north, the man-eater as fence. A horror story doing quiet service as child safety on a coastline where the tide and the cliffs took bairns every year in plain fact. Plenty of people along that stretch, now in their later years, will tell you they were raised on exactly those warnings, and that the warnings worked. Stand back from all of that and the through line is plain enough. Every era finds its own use for the family in the cave. The 18th century used them to sell books and maybe, depending on how you weighed the evidence earlier, to sneer at a neighbour nation. The Victorians used them for shudders in the parlour. The coast uses them now for visitors, and mothers there once used them for fences. The story keeps accepting the work, whatever the work is, and I suspect that flexibility comes from how little of it is nailed down. The dates wobble from one telling to the next. The names refuse to check out, and nobody has ever produced a grave, a trial roll, or a bone. A tale that's certain of its facts would have hardened into history and gone brittle. This one stayed soft, and every generation reshapes it with warm hands. One version of that reshaping happens quietly, on the ground, in the place itself, and it makes the right last stop before the beach. Ask around Ballantrae and Girvan and Lendlefoot today, and you will find the full range of relationships with the story. Some locals roll their eyes at it, a tourist thing, an embarrassment with a gift shop smell on it. Some tell it absolutely straight, cave and king and fires and all, and will point you to the path. And some hold the middle position, the one I have the most affection for, delivered usually with a shrug toward the headland. Something happened out there. Maybe the numbers grew in the telling, maybe the king rode in from a printer's desk, but people went missing on that coast. People have always gone missing on coasts like that, and the cave is real, and you can go and stand in it, and standing in it, the argument tends to lose its grip on you anyway. The dark in there does not care when it was first written down. We are nearly done, and we will finish where the story lives, down on that shore. First, though, the inside of the family itself, in the long years between the founding and the fall, the part of the tale no teller has ever really been able to look at directly. Run the story's own timeline and the household you get is stranger than any single night of violence in it. 25 years in one cave, children born there who grew up, paired off with their siblings and raised children of their own there. So by the end the cave held 3 generations, from Sawney, now a man in his 50s or 60s, grey, scarred, a grandfather many times over, down to grandchildren who could have been toddlers when the soldiers came. The old accounts describe the clan at capture as barely recognizable as people, matted and snarling, and the grim question underneath the description is what they spoke and what they knew. The eldest sons might have carried dim memories of the world, a village, a church bell, whatever Sawney and Agnes brought west with them. The grandchildren had nothing. Whatever the cave spoke was their language, the trade was their schooling, and their map of the universe ended at a wet passage, a beach, and a stretch of road that grew food. Some of the middle children were, by the timeline, in their 20s and 30s by the end, adults who had spent whole lives inside a household where the daily work was ambush and butchery, and the pantry was hung with neighbours, and who by every account went about that work without the slightest sense that anything was wrong, since wrong requires a comparison, and they had none. Even the practical rhythm of the place, once you start turning it over, has horror folded into every ordinary corner. Firewood had to be gathered from the shore, salt acquired or rendered from seawater in quantities that a curing operation of that scale would burn through constantly. Fresh water had to come from somewhere, a burn coming off the headland, carried in by the bucketful past the barrels. The tide dictated everything, when the family could hunt, when they could dump the surplus, when they were sealed in together, 48 people in the dark for hours at a stretch, twice a day, with the fire and the smell and each other. Winter storms on that coast can shut the shore for days. Illness must have come through. Childbirth went however it went with no help on earth, and the story says nothing about any of it. No deaths inside the family in 25 years, no graves of their own, a silence that is either an oversight or the bleakest joke in the whole tradition, that the one household in Scotland with meat always on hand never once records a loss. And at the head of it all, him. The tale gives Sawney no interior life whatsoever, and denies him even a line of speech until the cursing at the very end, and the emptiness ends up working like a portrait. A man who walked away from a spade in East Lothian and built, in a hole, the only thing he ever built, a family, a business, a fortress, a doctrine, all of them the same thing, all of them made of other people. By the end, he had done what almost no criminal in any era manages. He had raised his own succession. The operation no longer needed him. Sons ran ambushes, daughters ran the larder, grandchildren were coming up in the trade, and if the man from the fair had never broken through, the story's own logic runs on with no ending at all, the clans simply continuing, generation into generation, a permanent species of 24 hunters living in the coastline like weather. The tale needed a miracle to stop them, and knows it, and that is exactly why the ending it built is so total. The fires at Leith consuming every last child, the lines stamped out to the final infant. Whoever shaped this story understood that an audience would not sleep if even one of them were left over. Then Girvan went and told the hairy tree anyway, and added one, and hanged her too. The second loose end is the king, and what became of him, since the story borrows his name, and it seems only fair to return him. In 1603, Elizabeth of England died childless, and James VI of Scotland inherited her throne, packed his court, and moved south to London to become James I of England, the two crowns settling onto one head. Follow the geography of that. The monarch this legend casts as the destroyer of the beans spent the rest of his life in the city, whose printers, a century and a bit later, would put out the earliest surviving copies of the tale, starring him. He arrived in London to pageants and suspicion in roughly equal measure. A Scottish king over Englishmen who told Sawney jokes in the theatres, and when the crime writers eventually needed a royal hero to march 400 men into an Ayrshire cave, they reached for the one Scottish king their English audience knew by heart. He fits the part so well, the witch hunter and self-dramatist, that the casting has carried the story for 3 centuries. His well-kept papers, meanwhile, sit in the archives holding their silence on the whole affair, and the story leaves you holding both. Count the dead next. 1,000 is the number the big versions claim, and numbers that size go abstract on you unless you break them down, so break it down. 1,000 people over 25 years is 40 a year. 40 a year is somebody every 9 days or so for a quarter of a century from one thinly peopled district. Parishes in that corner of Scotland counted their souls in the hundreds. A toll like that would have hollowed out the region several times over, which the story, to its credit, openly says it did, the depopulated roads, the abandoned inns, and which the record, as we have covered, does not echo anywhere. But even the skeptic's version of this story has a body count, and I find it the more haunting of the two. Take away the clan entirely, and the coast still 8 people. At the ordinary background rate, all such coasts 8 people. The drowned, the lost, the murdered by ordinary men, the ones who walked out of Ballantrae toward Girvan on a November afternoon and simply never became anything again. No cave required. The legend, at absolute minimum, is a mass grave for all of them. Every real vanished traveller that shore ever swallowed, folded by the storytellers into one address with one name over the door. People needed the disappearances to mean something, to have a face, a villain, an ending with fires in it. An empty road offers none of that. Sawney does. So back, one last time, to the beach at Bennane Head. Go in the evening, at the bottom of the tide, when the light comes in low off the firth, and Ayrshire Craig sits out on the water with the sun going down its far side. The old road above you is silent, the new one far enough away that the sea covers it. You cross the rocks, wet to the ankle in the last pools, and the wall across the cave mouth stands up out of the shadow of the cliff, the doorway a black slot, the little window beside it blacker. Snib's cairn is there on the approach, stones off this beach stacked by a neighbour's hands, and you pass it going in as you would pass a font. Inside, the daylight gives up within a few steps. The passage bends, and the sound of the water behind you thins out to nothing. And somewhere in the dark ahead, since 2023 at least, a carved face is waiting for your torch to find it. Stand there a minute with the light off, if you can make yourself. The cold is the same cold. The dark is the same dark. Every century that has stood where you are standing has filled it with the same family, and whatever the archives say and whatever the folklorists say, the cave itself has an argument they cannot answer. The argument the dogs made at the entrance 400 years ago. Something about this place refuses to be empty, and behind you, out past the wall and the cairn and the rocks, the tide has already turned and is coming back in, as it has twice a day since before anyone kept records at all, patiently shutting the door. That is the legend of Sawney Bean, all of it I can fit in one sitting anyway. Thanks for spending the evening down here with me, truly. These long ones are a marathon on both ends. If it kept you company, a like helps more than you would think, and subscribe if you want more nights like this. Everyone on Patreon and the YouTube members, you are the backbone of this whole operation, and if anyone fancies joining them, every link is in the description and the pinned comment. Tell me in the comments which legend I should walk into next. Sleep well, mind the coast road,